After natural increases and decreases in population, the second basic way that population numbers are altered is the result of the migration of people from one place to another, primarily as a result of relocation diffusion. People continue to migrate by the millions today, and research has shown that usually it is not just one factor, but a combination of factors that leads to the decision to move. It may include conflict, economic conditions, political strife, cultural circumstances, or even environmental change. So when people migrate, they sometimes bring more than simply their culture with them. They can also bring disease. So these are some of the issues that we're going to look at as they pertain to migration. One way to describe population movement is by the term mobility, which is a more general term covering all types of movements from one place to another. Mobility may be used to describe a wide array of human movement, ranging from a daily commute from suburb to city or suburb to suburb, or to an ocean-spanning permanent move. Human mobility is important in human geography because it speeds the diffusion of ideas, innovations, diseases, therefore intensifying spatial interaction and transforming regions. The second way to describe population movement is in terms of migration, which is a long distance, long-term, or permanent move to a new location. Moving from a particular location is defined as emigration, also known as outmigration. Moving to a particular location is defined as immigration or in-migration. For example, a Canadian who moves to Australia emigrates from Canada and immigrates to Australia. This type of move from one country to another is called international migration. Moves may also occur within a particular country or region, in which case they are called internal migration. Internal migration can be further divided into two types: interregional migration, which is the movement from one region of a country to another in the same country, or intra-regional migration, which is the movement within one region of a country. About 4% of the world's people are international migrants. That is, they currently live in countries other than those in which they were born. International migration is a result of either voluntary migration or forced migration, which we will look at more closely later on. The major flows of migration are from less developed to more developed countries. On this map, you can see that the width of the arrows shows the amount of net migration between regions of the world. Countries with net in-migration are in red, and those with net out-migration are in blue. For those people who migrate, the process generally ranks as one of the greatest events of their lives. Migration takes place when people decide that moving is preferable to staying, when the difficulties of moving seem more than offset by the expected rewards. Most people find internal migration less traumatic than international migration because they find familiar language, foods, music, literature, and other social customs after they move. Internal migration also generally involves much shorter distances than does international migration. Let's take a look at Mexico, for example. Mexico's two principal interregional migration flows are net migration from the south to the north and from the center to the north, as shown in the red arrow. Mexico's principal intra-regional migration flow is from Mexico City to outer states in the Mexico City metropolitan area, as shown in the black arrow. Also shown are Mexico's two principal patterns of international migration, that is, arrivals from Central America and departures to the United States. Geographer Wilbur Zielinski identified a migration transition which consists of changes in a society comparable to those in the demographic transition. According to the migration transition, international migration is primarily a phenomenon of countries in stage 2 of the demographic transition, whereas internal migration is often a phenomenon of countries in stages 3 and 4 of the demographic transition. As long ago as 1885, British demographer Ernest Ravenstein was one of the first people to study internal migration in England. On the basis of his data, he proposed several laws. These were observations, really, of migration that are still relevant today. Here are 6 of his 11 laws. The first observation that Ravenstein made was that the majority of migrants that left a particular location tend to move shorter distances, while fewer migrants tend to move longer distances. He referred to this as distance or friction decay. Average migration distance undoubtedly has increased since Ravenstein's time. Still, the number of people who leave a given location generally tend to travel shorter distances compared to those who travel longer distances. Reason being is that there may be opportunities along a pathway that migrants may decide to take. So his second law stated that migration proceeds in various steps, not just one long movement. For example, a peasant family in Brazil is likely to move first to a village, then to a nearby town, later to a city, and finally to a metropolis, such as Rio de Janeiro. And at each stage, a new set of pull factors, meaning factors that induce people to move to a particular location, come into play. So not all migrants complete all of these steps, because along the way, the majority are captured by intervening opportunities. This is what happened when African Americans migrated northward after World War I in the United States, looking for work in growing cities like Chicago and Cleveland. Many, however, found employment in St. Louis and Cincinnati. That is, they encountered intervening opportunities along their northbound routes. There are, however, also what are called intervening obstacles. This can be environmental or political that hinders migration. Historically, the principal obstacle faced by migrants to other countries was environmental. The long, arduous, and expensive passage over land or by sea. Transportation improvements over the last century by road, canal, train, car, and airplanes have diminished those types of environmental obstacles. Today, the major intervening obstacles faced by most immigrants are political. Legally, a migrant needs a passport to emigrate from a country and a visa to immigrate to a new country. Intervening obstacles often cause people to engage in step migration, which is migration that follows a path of a series of stages or steps toward a final destination. The third observation Ravenstein made is that migrants who move longer distances tend to choose big city destinations. London was the great magnet in Ravenstein's time, and other British cities were mushrooming as a result of migration. Basically, the larger centers of population, or larger cities, tend to draw more migrants than smaller places because those larger places have a stronger pull on migrants. For example, there are greater job opportunities. The fourth observation that he made was that each major stream of migration often produces a counter current of lesser strength. In other words, every migration flow generates a return or counter migration. So the actual migration volume is the original flow minus that of the return. So not everybody's happy when they migrate. Some people return, but that return number is lower and weaker than the number that leaves. All migration streams have a counter current between countries or within countries. For example, about 13 million people came to the United States between about 1900 and 1914. Of that number, 4 million people returned to their home countries. And the fifth observation is that most migrants are adult males seeking some type of job opportunity. You have fewer adult females and yet fewer children who are going to be migrants. Most of the immigration streams of people who are non-documented migrants coming to the United States are males, usually between the ages of 15 and 34. They leave their home locations, usually seeking out job opportunities in order to economically assist the place that they came from. While this observation held true for U.S. immigrants during the 19th and much of the 20th centuries, female immigration to the United States began to outnumber male immigrants around 1970. Female immigrants also outnumber males in other developed countries. Two factors contribute to the larger share of females immigrating to developed countries than theorized by Ravenstein. One is the high percentage of women in the labor force in developed countries logically attracts a high percentage of female immigrants. And two, some developed countries have made it possible for wives to join husbands who have already immigrated. And the last of Ravenstein's laws that we'll mention is that most migration takes place for economic reasons. Certainly there are other migrations that aren't necessarily economically motivated, which we will discuss shortly. I'm sure in this class we have people who have migrated themselves or who have relatives who've migrated from some other area of the world to the United States, or have even migrated from some other region of the U.S. to California. Migration patterns are related to either pull or push factors, or possibly a combination of both for some people. Geographers who study human migration have identified conditions and perceptions that tend to induce people to leave their place of residence. This is called a push factor. It's also viewed as a forced pattern of migration. Geographers have also identified circumstances that effectively attract people to certain locations from other places. This is what we refer to as pull factors, also viewed as voluntary conditions of migration. Ravenstein suggested that people migrate for three reasons: environmental, economic, and cultural. In terms of environmental, people are pulled toward beautiful places and pushed from hazardous ones. Attractive environments for migrants include mountains, seasides, and warm climates. Good soil for farming is also another natural attraction. In the United States, as time went on, people got across barriers like the Appalachian Mountains. The vast open area in the western part of the U.S. was a place for land to be acquired and farms to be established. On the other side of this is water, either too much or too little, poses the most common environmental threat. For example, rising waters during hurricanes can force people to migrate. In fact, large-scale forced migration occurred in recent years in the United States because of hurricanes Katrina, Harvey, and Maria. Most people migrate for economic reasons. People often emigrate from places that have few job opportunities and immigrate to places where jobs seem to be available. Because of economic restructuring, such as a decline in manufacturing and an increase in services, job prospects often vary from one country to another and within regions of the same country. People may be forced to migrate for political reasons as well. Political reasons are often classified as examples of forced migration because people may be compelled to leave a region because of religious or cultural persecution, civil war, genocide, an unstable government, disintegration of the rule of law, and similar dangerous circumstances. Throughout history, there have been many examples of voluntary and forced migration. In voluntary migration, an individual chooses to move, usually for economic reasons, though sometimes for environmental reasons as well. Where migration occurs against the individual's will, push factors can produce forced migration, meaning that the migrant has been compelled to move because of political conflict or adverse environmental conditions. The distinction, however, between forced migration and voluntary migration is not clear-cut. For example, a person who migrates for economic reasons may seek a better life through improved access to jobs and food, but could also be compelled to migrate because of violence in their country of origin. Oftentimes, then, the decision to migrate is a mixed one reflecting both forced and voluntary factors. A good example of this is seen in the changing U.S. immigration. If we look at the migration pattern for the United States, we can see that there has been quite a bit of change over time. As the world's third most populous country, the U.S. is inhabited overwhelmingly by direct descendants of immigrants. About 80 million people migrated to the U.S. between 1820 and 2020. The U.S. saw three main eras of migration. First was the immigration from Europe and Africa in the 17th and 18th centuries during the colonial era. Most Europeans were voluntary immigrants. However, harsh economic conditions and religious persecution in Europe at the time blurred the distinction between forced and voluntary migration. Most African immigrants had been captured in Africa and forcibly transported to the U.S., where they were sold as properties. The second main era of immigration in the United States was the mass immigration from Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For many immigrants from Europe, the U.S. offered a great opportunity for economic success. Migration from Europe to the U.S. peaked at several points during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Desperate economic factors in their native countries compelled Irish and Germans to cross the Atlantic during the 1840s and 1850s. The Industrial Revolution, diffused to Scandinavia during the 1880s, triggered a rapid population increase and induced many people from there to emigrate to the United States in search of jobs. The shift in the primary source of immigrants coincided with the diffusion of the Industrial Revolution to Southern and Eastern Europe during the early 20th century, along with rapid population growth in those regions. And the third main era of immigration was the immigration from Asia and Latin America in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Although the pattern of immigration to the U.S. has changed over the country's history, the reasons for immigration to the country remain virtually unchanged. Rapid population growth and limited prospects for economic advancement at home, combined with hopes for economic opportunity and social advancement in the United States. Europeans left when their countries entered stage 2 of the demographic transition in the 19th century, and Latin Americans and Asians have responded to similar motivations in recent years. One type of voluntary external migration is contract labor migration. This was an important type of migration, especially from many parts of the world after the end of slavery. The demand for labor increased after slavery was officially abolished by European countries that were involved with slavery. The need for a large amount of labor rose again after World War II within the various European countries that were damaged economically during the Second World War. Because Europe lost a large number of people, especially males, during the war years, there was a need for labor to improve their economic conditions. However, until recently, immigrants were regarded as useful additions to the labor force in Europe. With most European countries in stage 4 or 5 of the demographic transition, characterized by stagnant or declining population, immigrants took low status and low skill jobs that local residents didn't want to do. In cities such as Berlin, Brussels, Paris, and Zurich, immigrants provide essential services such as driving buses, collecting garbage, repairing streets, and washing dishes. Germany and other developed European countries operated guest worker programs, mainly during the 1960s and 1970s, in which people from developing countries were allowed to immigrate temporarily to obtain jobs. Although relatively low paid by European standards, immigrants could earn far more than they would in their home country. The guest workers were expected to be examples of circular migration, which is the temporary movement of a migrant worker between their home and host countries to seek employment. However, many immigrants who arrived originally under the guest worker program have remained permanently in Europe. So migration issues have been especially challenging for European countries in recent years. On the one hand, it is easier than ever before for a European to migrate from one country to another within Europe. Most of that migration, again, primarily for work, is from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe to the Western and Northern parts of Europe. At the same time, it is harder for non-Europeans to migrate into Europe. In fact, in recent years, immigrants trying to reach Europe from Africa and Asia have been less welcoming. Many Europeans fear that long-standing cultural traditions of the host country are threatened by immigrants who adhere to different religions and have different cultural traditions. Many African immigrants try to reach Europe by dangerous boat passages across the Mediterranean Sea. Labor migration also exists in other parts of the world. The oil-producing countries such as Qatar and Yemen in the Middle East are a good example of that. Qatar is an oil exporting country in the Persian Gulf, while Yemen is a relatively poor country in the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula. There's an outmigration of males from Yemen and an overabundance of males in Qatar. Much of that are laborers that have migrated to work in the oil-related businesses in the Persian Gulf. You also see males from other parts of the world, for example, Korea and the Philippines, migrating to these oil-producing countries as contract laborers. But in addition, there are females who are also employed as contract laborers, and the number of females who migrate for that reason has certainly increased since Ravenstein's time. For example, there is an overwhelming number of females in Jordan who come from the Philippines, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Uganda, and they take up work as domestic workers and also as garment workers. So there's a tremendous amount of migration worldwide having to do with labor. One example of where there's been a lot of internal voluntary migration historically taking place is right here in the United States. The U.S. Census computes the country's population and its population center every decade in zero-ending years, such as 2020. An especially prominent example of interregional migration in the U.S. during the 19th century was the opening of the West. People pushed west where land to farm was abundant. The changing location of the population center graphically is demonstrated in the changing center of U.S. population map, and it demonstrates the march of Americans across the North American continent. This was largely through transportation and communication innovations, capital investment, and large internal population movements. Between 1860 and 1920, the U.S. was transformed from a rural to an urban society as industrialization created new jobs. As a result, increasing numbers of agricultural workers, along with foreign immigrants, moved to urban areas to work in the manufacturing sector. Basically, as the country industrialized, its population urbanized, with machines replacing human labor on the farm and replacing farm hands operating machines in the factories. One of the greatest migration waves began early in the 1940s and continued through the 1970s. This involved the massive and very rapid movement of mostly African Americans out of the rural South to cities in the South, North, and West. Although African Americans formed considerable populations in cities such as Chicago and New York before the onset of this wave, the mechanization of cotton picking pushed additional large numbers of these people out of the rural areas. Tenant cotton picking was a major source of livelihood for African Americans in the Deep South until mechanization reduced the number of jobs available. But at the same time, pull factors attracted them to the large cities. Large number of jobs in the defense-oriented manufacturing sector became available. Since the early 20th century, when tens of thousands of African American families migrated from the South to the industrializing cities of the Rust Belt, there has been a counter-migration of African Americans back to the South. As more of these African Americans start to retire, they are deciding to move back to their home states. Also, some centers like Atlanta, a major economical center in Georgia, attracts professional African Americans to migrate to that location as well. Intra-regional migration is much more common than inter-regional or international migration. There are three types of migration that takes place within a region. The first is migration from rural or non-metropolitan areas to urban or metropolitan areas, which began in the 1800s in Europe and North America as part of the Industrial Revolution. As with inter-regional migrants, most people who move from rural to urban areas seek economic advancement. They are pushed from rural areas by declining opportunities in agriculture, such as having to pay higher rents for farmland, and are pulled to the cities by the prospect of work in factories or in service industries. In recent years, urbanization has diffused to developing countries in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. The second type of migration that takes place within a region is from urban to suburban areas. Most intra-regional migration in developed countries is from cities to surrounding suburbs. The population of most cities in developed countries has declined since the mid-20th century, while suburbs have grown rapidly. In fact, nearly twice as many Americans migrate from cities to suburbs each year compared to those who migrate from suburbs to cities. These same patterns can be seen in Canada and Europe as well. The major reason for the large-scale migration to the suburbs is not related to employment, however, as is the case with other forms of migration. For most people, migration to suburbs does not coincide with changing jobs. Rather, people are attracted by a suburban lifestyle. Suburbs offer the opportunity to live in a detached house rather than an apartment surrounded by a private yard where their children can play safely. However, as a result of suburbanization, the territory occupied by urban areas has rapidly expanded, which means that to accommodate suburban growth, farms on the periphery of urban areas are converted to housing and commercial developments, where new roads, sewers, and other services must be built. And lastly, developed countries witnessed a new migration trend beginning in the late 20th century. For the first time, more people emigrated into rural areas than emigrated out of them in some years. Net migration from urban to rural counties is called counter-urbanization, which results in part from very rapid expansion of suburbs. Counter-urbanization represents a genuine migration from cities and suburbs to small towns and rural communities. People move from urban to rural areas largely for lifestyle reasons. Some are attracted to rural areas by the prospect of exchanging the frantic pace of urban life for the opportunity to live on a farm, perhaps where they can own a horse or grow some vegetables. Others move to farms but do not earn their living from agriculture. Instead, they work in nearby offices, small town shops, or other services. Counter-urbanization is not a phenomenon that occurs every year, however. Before COVID-19, cities had become more attractive to those wanting to relocate, especially for younger people. In comparison to voluntary migration, several of the world's largest migration streams have been forced migration. In forced migrations, the relocation decision is made solely by people other than the migrants themselves. By far the most important of this type of migration was the transatlantic slave trade, which forcibly transferred tens of millions of Africans as slaves to the Western Hemisphere from the early 18th to early 19th centuries. How many Africans were sold into slavery will probably never be known. Estimates range from 12 million to over 15 million, and possibly even higher. The transatlantic slave trade map indicates only their destinations and the proportions transported to each of them. Half or more were sent to plantations in the Caribbean and eastern South America, though nearly 1 million arrived in British North America, later becoming the United States. Brazil, by far, has ended up with the greatest number of slaves during that time. Slavery existed in West Africa for many centuries. These enslaved people were servants or workers. Some of them had been captured during wars or had been found guilty of crimes. People from West Africa were also traded across the Sahara Desert primarily by Arabs. Each year, several thousand Africans were traded to countries in the Middle East for salt and other goods. Although these slaves were not free, many of the slaves in West Africa remained part of the larger family in a village. They may have had fewer rights than other villagers, but they could own land to farm. They could even become skilled workers and earn money. Their descendants could become free. Traders from Europe changed this way of life in West Africa. After founding colonies in the Americas, many Europeans had sugar and tobacco plantations that needed workers. Using slaves was a cheap way to get the work done. So much of this exchange or trade that took place has been called the triangular trade, with guns, alcohol, and manufactured goods being shipped to Africa in exchange for slaves who were then sent to the Americas. There, the slaves were exchanged for gold, silver, tobacco, sugar, and rum, which were then shipped to Europe. Sugarcane, which was grown in the Caribbean islands, for instance, could be converted to molasses. That molasses could have been shipped to other parts of the world, such as the east coast of the United States, where it was converted to rum, or it could be shipped to England. And then from England, cloth and trinkets, which are small ornaments or pieces of jewelry, along with other manufactured goods, were carried back to Africa to trade for more slaves. So you had a triangular pattern of trade across the Atlantic Ocean involving human cargo along with products that were agricultural byproducts as well as manufactured goods. This was without a doubt a very tragic event for Africans taken into slavery. In Africa, families were destroyed, children orphaned, and communities disrupted. And once abroad, the African slaves faced not only terror but loneliness as well. Many Africans brought with them their language and cultural traits and defined the many parts of the world where slaves ended up. Many of these traditions are still carried on today. There are so many examples of forced migration that are motivated by political or cultural, including religious reasons. Too many to include in this chapter. But I do want to provide you with one more example of forced migration, and that is the partition of British India. In August 1947, when after 300 years in India, the British finally left, and the Indian subcontinent was split into Hindu majority India and Muslim majority Pakistan. This resulted in one of the largest mass migrations in human history, and violence on a scale that had seldom been seen before. As the provinces of the Punjab and Bengal were effectively split in half, approximately 7 million Hindus and Sikhs and 7 million Muslims found themselves in the wrong country. Believing they would return quote-unquote home, many families left their valuables behind before they packed up their essential belongings and began the trek to India or West or East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh. However, many never made it. Across the Indian subcontinent, communities that had coexisted for almost a millennium attacked each other in a terrifying outbreak of sectarian violence, with Hindus and Sikhs on one side and Muslims on the other, a mutual genocide as unexpected as it was unprecedented. The carnage was especially intense, with massacres, arson, forced conversions, mass abductions, and savage sexual violence. Some 75,000 women were raped, and many of them were then disfigured or dismembered. By 1948, as the Great Migration drew to a close, more than 15 million people had been uprooted. We're talking about refugees here. And between 1 and 2 million were dead. Unfortunately, this type of forced migration was a result of both sides believing that it was impossible for adherents of the two religions to live together peacefully. Refugees are a special class of immigrants because they have been dislocated involuntarily from their original place of settlement. A refugee is forced to migrate to another country to avoid armed conflict, violence, violations of human rights, or other threats to their well-being. Often a refugee is an immigrant who cannot return to their country of origin for fear of persecution because of race, religion, nationality, or political opinion. An internally displaced person, on the other hand, has been forced to migrate for reasons similar to those of a refugee, but an internally displaced person has not migrated across an international border. And oftentimes we have asylum seekers. These are people who have migrated to another country in the hope of being recognized as a refugee. The largest numbers of refugees and internally displaced persons in recent years are from Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, and Somalia. Ongoing civil wars in those countries cause this forced political migration. Neighboring countries received the most refugees. For example, refugees in Pakistan and Iran are primarily from Afghanistan. In Uganda and Ethiopia, they are primarily from South Sudan. Let's not forget the most recent out-migration of people from the Ukraine as a result of Russia's invasion. According to the United Nations, more than 13 million people have fled their homes since Russia's invasion of Ukraine beginning February 24th, 2022. More than 5 million have left for neighboring countries, while 8 million people are thought to be displaced inside of Ukraine itself. Regardless of their numbers, refugees tend to be the most powerless, deprived, threatened people in the world. Often they face death while governments and relief agencies quarrel over rescue plans and political bureaucracy.